As humans rapidly expand the exploration and settlement of near and deep space, they will face, as did the frontier explorers of the past, various hard and often unpredictable challenges and problems. Many of these situations will require rapid and perhaps untested responses. This is episode 22, Primal Intelligence and Human Space Exploration. Our guest today is Angus Fletcher, Professor of Story Science and Director of the Fisher College of Business Leadership Initiative at Ohio State University. In 2023, he was awarded the Army Commendation Medal for his groundbreaking research with the U.S. Special Operations into the neural origins of intuition, imagination, and common sense. He's authored more than 100 peer-reviewed book chapters and academic articles in literary studies, neuroscience, philosophy, and business. His most recent book is the instant national bestseller, Primal Intelligence. U.S. Army Special Operations has embraced and utilizes primal training for its most sensitive classified units. As a result, Special Operations saw the future faster. They healed quicker from trauma, and in life and death situations, they chose wiser and smarter. Angus is now turning his attention to how primal training and techniques could apply and effectively be deployed for astronauts. Our host and moderator is Chris Kimmel, founder of Humanity in Deep Space and co-founder of the commercial space enterprise Space Tango.
Good afternoon. This is Chris Kimmel with Humanity in Deep Space. I want to welcome all of our attendees today for what I believe is going to be a particularly interesting conversation, a little bit different slant on things. But as those of you who have tuned in before know that Humanity in Deep Space is an enterprise that really is devoted to creating a conversation and projects and looking at basically the intersections between different disciplines and ideas as it relates to humans, us becoming and continuing our transition to a spacefaring civilization. When I give talks, I always remind people that we are, in fact, a spacefaring civilization. That's not something in the future. We've been in space since the 60s. We've been to the moon and back. We've had people living and working in space for decades. And of course, the robots on Mars, the technology on Mars is simply an extension of us as humans. So we are very, very much a spacefaring civilization. Let me thank our sponsors to start off with, who make these webcasts and our projects and the other live events that we do possible. Space 629. I might also mention that the person behind Space 629, one of our big supporters, is Clint Kelly. And Clint is a collaborator and a friend. And Clint just took his second, within the past week, his second Blue Origin flight. So I want to congratulate him for another successful launch. And then Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, Space for Good, the National Stem Cell Foundation, Baird Financial, the Media Collaboratory, Kentucky Humanities Council, Visit Lex Human Space Solutions, Higher Orbits, Space Tango, 22 Solutions, and the Interstellar Foundation. Thank all of them as well. So let me start out by introducing Angus Fletcher. I've known Angus now for a couple of years. I actually got to him after reading his first book that I picked up in a bookstore and thought, well, this sounds really interesting. And I've been talking with him ever since and have enjoyed our conversations and everything he's doing. So let me ask Angus to start off by just introducing himself.
Hi, my name is Professor Angus Fletcher. I teach at Ohio State University. I'm currently directing Fisher, which is our business college's Leadership Institute, and very honored to be here. And I have spent a little bit of time working with astronauts, but primarily over the past 4 years, I've been working with U.S. Army Special Operations.
Yeah, so Angus, for those of you, his latest book, which is out, which we'll be talking about, is called Primal Intelligence. It's now a New York bestseller. I would encourage you to pick up a copy. It's one of the most eclectic and interesting reads you'll have recently, I promise. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that. But I want to start. Angus's background is so interesting. And when I first met him, I was so intrigued that I'm going to actually ask him to kind of start at the beginning and kind of give us his story about how he got to where he is today and the things that he thinks about. As he has said, he's a professor of story science at Ohio State University, but his also career has spanned a number of years in neurosciences. And so he has brought those two together in a really interesting way and approach to thinking and decision making. So, Angus, I'll let you start at the beginning and tell us how you got to where you are and how you got to this book.
So at the very beginning, I started out in a neurophysiology lab at the University of Michigan Medical School, and we were essentially studying how neurons worked. And as a result of that study, I became increasingly aware of the fact that human brains work very differently from computers. We work very differently from artificial intelligence. And the most simple way to experience that is the more information, the more data you give a computer, the smarter it gets. Whereas with humans, if you start giving us information, we get very quickly overwhelmed. Humans do not like to be given a lot of information. And so it's often said, hey, actually, if you want to communicate with a human, what you should do is not give them a lot of data, you should give them story. And this has sort of become a truism that humans understand things better through story. What I started to realize at the lab is not just that humans communicate through story, but humans think in story. And in fact, most of our mental operations are narrative in some manner. What does that mean? Well, what a narrative is it's a sequence of events. It's a plot. And another word for a plot is a plan. And most human intelligence involves making new plans. A new plan is your way to influence the world. It's your way to come up with a story of what tomorrow could be that's different from today. And what's interesting about the way that humans do this is unlike computers and unlike generative AI, human creativity is not random. It's not produced by processes like divergent thinking or ideation or any of these kinds of things. It's produced by other processes, narrative processes, which run on the sort of physical elements of the human neuron. And so starting back in that physiology lab, what I wanted to do is I wanted to understand how it is that human brains think in narrative as a way of understanding how we invent and create plans, and as also a way of understanding how we can improve human intelligence to make more effective plans faster. So I then kind of had this very itinerant career following that. I went off to Yale. I got my PhD in literature studying Shakespeare. I went to Stanford, where I had the opportunity to work a little bit in Silicon Valley and quite a lot with companies like Pixar. I went down for a few years to work in Los Angeles at the University of Southern California, spent a lot of time working in Hollywood. And then I was finally recruited here to Project Narrative at Ohio State, which is the world's leading institute for the study of narrative. And I sort of bring the neuroscience to that study of narrative. I'm very interested in not just the mechanical processes through which humans create narrative and process narrative, but how we can improve those so that we can have more imagination. We can have more common sense. We can have more intuition. We can understand how to use our emotions better because all these processes are ultimately non-computational processes that are associated with narrative. And for most of my career, I was regarded as something of an oddity. I'm like a neuroscientist who studies narrative in a literature department, what's going on there. But about 4 years ago, I got contacted by U.S. Army Special Operations, and they gave me the opportunity to start taking a lot of these ideas and translate them into action with their teams. And the main reason that the U.S. Army was so interested is because their units work in environments that are very volatile, that are constantly changing. So in other words, have very little information. And the way you succeed in those environments is you have to be able to make effective plans. You have to activate your imagination to come up with new plans and then your common sense to pick the most effective plan to use in that environment. And so I had the opportunity not just to work with those units, but to test and assess some of the training that we developed. And then we've kind of moved it from there into the regular Army and then into regular schools all the way down to kids as young as 8. So that's kind of a snapshot on me. I study something called narrative cognition. I'm basically the only person in the world really to study that. It exists at the intersection of neuroscience and narrative theory. And recently, over the past couple of years, it's been tested by some of these elite units, but is really not gone mainstream yet.
Yeah, Angus, thank you. And by the way, those of you who are attending today can ask any questions on the curated chat. So feel free to, when something strikes you that you'd like to know, or if you want to just make a comment, please feel free to do that. We'll get to as many of those as we can as the conversation goes on. So Angus, one of the things that when I first met you, which I was struck by, and you've kind of alluded to it, I kind of came to you from reading about primarily about your literature work in storytelling and stuff. And then somehow during the conversation, you threw in, oh, yeah, by the way, I trained special forces. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. That's not something I would have expected. So I want to talk a little bit, ask you to ask a little bit about how your thoughts on how literature and story have evolved over time to actually serve as I think you actually talked them as technologies, new technologies, how those things have evolved and been used to actually change, influence our way of thinking.
Yeah, so we misunderstand literature and story in the modern world. If you ask almost anybody what the purpose of literature or stories is, they will tell you it's to communicate a message. And so the idea is that somehow if we can create a story that has our point of view in it, and that story is effective enough, then it will make other people think the same way that we think. And there's another term for this, which is propaganda. So we've essentially reduced literature and stories to a form of propaganda, to trying to get other people to think what we think, this kind of messaging and counter messaging. And this, there's a history of this, but it gets particularly intense during the mid 20th century for various reasons, when the CIA starts to kind of come into English departments and whatnot. And so that's the tradition of story and narrative that I resist. Humans in general, we don't like to be brainwashed by stories. Even if you go into a society where you see a kind of very strong propaganda engine, you find that most people under it are quite skeptical of the stories that are being circulated. And actually, really, the value of literature historically has not been to condition people into thinking a particular way, but it's been to activate people's powers of imagination. I mean, that's the most fundamental power of literature. I think all of us have experienced that as a child when you read a story for the first time and you start thinking, wow, what would I do as that character? What would I do if I existed in that world? When I was a young person, I read some Arthurian legends. I spent a lot of time imagining what I would do if I was an Arthurian knight. If you've ever read a story about an explorer, an adventurer, an astronaut, Tom Swift, these stories spark your imagination and they start to make you think, well, what could I do? And so what I'm really interested in from a literary perspective is how the kinds of stories we circulate as a society stimulate imagination, stimulate new ideas, new thinking, original thinking, as opposed to how stories kind of pass on messages or are vehicles for, powerful people or different entities to tell us what to think.
And so you talk a lot about being influenced by things like through Shakespeare and other kinds of things. So can you say a little bit more about how I thought that was kind of interesting as well?
Yeah, so when we're talking about what it is that literature is used for, we want to start to think, well, what have been the most effective stories in history? What are the stories that have had the most effect and the most power? And one of the extraordinary things about the modern world is if you look at people who have shaped the modern world, a great many of them were deeply, fundamentally influenced by Shakespeare. So who read Shakespeare? Who credited Shakespeare for their influence? Well, we have Nikola Tesla, we have Steve Jobs, we have Vincent van Gogh, we have Marie Curie, we have Abraham Lincoln. We have all of these folks who are reading Shakespeare and being inspired in some cases to think of new scientific or artistic or technological ideas, but also in the case of someone like Abraham Lincoln, to develop their common sense, to develop their ability to lead. And so I just became very fascinated with the fact that there was clearly something happening in Shakespeare, which was new at the time, because Shakespeare's writing is very different from the writing that precedes it. The kinds of stories that he tells are very different from the kinds of stories that were sort of popular in even just the decades before. And I wanted to know what were those stories doing to the human brain that was activating the capacity of all of these leaders, all these innovators, all of these artists, all of these scientists. It doesn't have to stop with Shakespeare. There's other, narrative innovators out there. There's other innovative storytellers out there that have had a strong and powerful effect in their communities. But Shakespeare's a good place to go to start because you just see, in terms of our recent history, the enormous effect of his legacy.
So having said that, one of the things that I was intrigued by when I learned of your history, particularly working with special forces, and then working with companies to help them as well think through these kinds of problems, and particularly with respect to special forces, which I found particularly interesting. The idea that like astronauts, those who are increasingly leaving the planet, you're faced oftentimes as humans with very uncertain situations, unexpected situations, things that you haven't prepared for, things that are dangerous. That this particular training that you provide is used to help people in the case of special forces and combat troops, as well as, in my mind, it's very similar to some of the problems are very similar to astronauts, particularly as we become much more active in going back to the moon, more people going to low Earth orbit, and then ultimately at some point, perhaps Mars. How those things work out. So I'd like to go back and just ask you a little bit to talk a little bit more about specifically uh, one of the aspects of primal intelligence that you talk about in your book and that you've used, and some specific scenarios of what you actually do with special forces. Because in reading your book, you had some great stories, which I found were really intriguing.
Yeah, so primal intelligence is basically this way of thinking about narrative cognition, or this ability that our brain has to think in stories and to make plans. And so we divide primal intelligence into four big powers. The first is intuition, which is your ability to spot opportunities when something new is emerging in your environment. Then there's imagination. That's the second one. That's your ability to make plans to exploit those opportunities. Then there's common sense, which is your ability to pick the plan that you've created that's most likely to work in your environment. And finally, there's emotion, which guides you to pick the plan that's most likely to work for you. So, how does this cash out in terms of special forces and maybe a little bit with astronauts? Well, if you're an operator, the first thing is a lot of your
Can you explain an operator, what that is for everybody?
Sure, sure. Yeah. So an operator is, in my case, I work with the United States Army, and each of the different branches of the military has their own kind of special operations units. But in the case of the United States Army, there are three primary kinds of operator that I work with. The first kind are Green Berets, which are unclassified, and they go back, really to the 50s, but they kind of come to the fore during Vietnam. And they're basically teachers with parachutes. Their job is to kind of parachute into countries and train up sort of resistance forces to basically develop a kind of democratic insurgency. And so a lot of what they do is what's known as force multiplication. How do I go into a hostile environment, build rapport with people who don't know anything about me, build trust with them, start to then train them up quickly to act autonomously from me, because it's really important that when we're training these small teams, they be able to think quickly on their own, react to opportunities, make their own plans, and then start to create a culture of teamwork so that individuals are not just thinking independently, but are working together collectively for some overall goal. So even though they might be going towards that goal on different paths, they're all converging in the end, kind of like an intelligent swarm. So the first group that I work with are the Green Berets. The second two groups are classified Army units that fall under Joint Special Operations Command. I can't technically name them, but one of them is quite famous. It's a direct action unit. Its job is to do things like rescue hostages, for example. And the other one is an intelligence unit. And as often said to me, their job is to basically live a month, a year, 10 years, 100 years in the future, anticipating problems that the United States can encounter, and then figuring out ways to solve those problems before they occur. And it's actually that final unit, that intelligence unit, that's part of Joint Special Operations Command that identified me as someone who might be valuable and identified my research and brought me in. So basically, an operator is an individual that is empowered by the United States Army to act autonomously, oftentimes without a lot of direct supervision, in challenging, uncertain, volatile environments. A lot of these environments are literally conflicted combat environments where things are changing. They might also be environments where there isn't a stable government or a stable set of rules of engagement or laws. So you're constantly having to kind of navigate these very ambiguous, murky situations. But at the same time, you have an overall intent that you're trying to fulfill. It's often known in the Army as commander's intent. So you've got a job that you've got to do. And there's obviously certain bright lines or certain rules that you can't cross. You can't commit certain types of international crimes. You've got a lot of flexibility, you've got a lot of autonomy, but you've got these guardrails and you've got this overall goal that you're progressing towards. And so that's a little bit, I think, of a sketch of what an operator is.
Okay, and Ted, can you give us a few stories, anecdotes of some of the things specifically you've done in the field, and how I was intrigued by a number of things, training operations that you actually were a part of with the Special Forces, and some of the items you brought. I thought was particularly interested in one about, you told a story about when there was a blast that you're supposed to actually not run away from it, but run toward it. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I just, some of those kinds of insights.
Yeah, so this particular training exercise that you're referring to is known as Robin Sage. It's a kind of culmination exercise for the Green Berets. It's completely fascinating. Basically, the Green Berets take over thousands and thousands of square miles in North Carolina and South Carolina, and they run this enormous role-playing exercise. They call it role-playing with real bullets. And the premise of the exercise is that a foreign army has invaded the Carolinas and taken over and started this new country inside the domestic United States. It's kind of like a breakaway state within the United States. And each of these trainee teams, known as A teams, of special operators go in, and their job is to identify individuals within this huge role-playing exercise who might be able to help them start an insurgency. And so you have this kind of very open-ended mission, which is to go in, make friends, build up a kind of little rebel army, use that army to maybe take out some strong points, or to start to create chaos and uncertainty for this invading regime. So that's kind of the big backstory there. There's obviously a lot that I can't talk about, but I think that hopefully gives you a sense of kind of like the big picture. But the main purpose of this exercise is not to train Green Berets to do anything specific. It's instead to help them become more effective at taking the initiative and making new plans when their old plans break. So a kind of classic thing that will happen to you is, and this is one of the things I talk about in the book, is you'll be brought into a briefing room. You'll be given just these huge piles of information, giving you all this background, all of these backstories on this kind of local warlord that's in the area. You'll be told all about his different economic interests, and the ways in which he's making his money, and sort of exploiting various people, and where he gets his arms from, and this, that, and the other thing. And so you're given all this kind of information, and you stay up maybe for 24, 36, 48 hours, studying all this information, memorizing all this information, trying to make a plan, how to use it, how to execute that. And then you're dropped out of a helicopter and you're walking towards this individual. And when you're 3 steps away from this individual, suddenly the largest bomb you've ever heard goes off about 50 feet away from you. And the point of that is, how do you respond to this bomb? You spend all of your time planning this conversation you're going to have with this warlord, but instead a bomb has just gone off. And then the moment that bomb goes off, which sort of shatters the environment, that warlord you're talking to, he responds to the bomb. All the folks around him respond to the bomb. How are they going to respond to the bomb? They're going to respond unpredictably. Maybe they think that you brought the bomb. Maybe they think the bomb is your fault, so on and so forth. And so really what Robin Sage consists of is this exercise in which the moment that you've made a plan and you're executing your plan and your plan is working, the training team figures out a way to set off a bomb, literal or metaphorical, that destroys that plan, and then sees how quickly you can make a new plan to respond to that new situation. And a big part of what I did when I went in there, and I'd be happy to talk through this if you're interested, is identify the kind of neural mechanisms that are kind of in play there. Okay, so here was kind of one of the big breakthroughs that we had. So one of the things that the instructors noticed is that some Green Berets, some training Green Berets, were just much more effective at making new plans and leading teams than others. And historically, what that meant is that those individuals were just selected to become Green Berets, and everyone else was just removed from the program. And it was just said, you know what, you other people, you just don't have it. You weren't born with this gift, with this leadership gift. And I think all of us that have worked in these elite communities, whether it's astronauts, whether it's special forces or whatever, have seen this phenomenon where it just seems like some people have it. They've got the right stuff. And The problem with that, at least in terms of U.S. Army Special Operations, is that starting in the year 2000, they had to expand dramatically. They had to start training a lot more operators. And this was because of the global war on terror and the increasing reliance on Green Berets and other forms of special operators to go into Afghanistan and Iraq and do various types of covert missions and other types of force multiplication missions. So all of a sudden, they couldn't just identify and select the few individuals who just happened, for whatever reason, to be good at coming up with a new plan when a bomb went off. Instead, they had to figure out what are those individuals doing and how do we train other people to do it? And this was really challenging because of something known as the tacit knowledge problem. So the tacit knowledge problem is the better you are at something, the harder a time you have explaining how you do it. So if you're a great guitarist and I come up to you and say, hey, how do you play the guitar? You'll have a very hard time explaining to me how to do it. If you're a great surgeon, you have a very hard time explaining to me how you do it. And even something simple, like if you're trying to teach your kids how to drive a car, the moment you sit in the car and try to explain to them how to drive a car, you'll immediately realize that there are all sorts of things that your brain is doing automatically that you're not explaining to the person. And you've got to slow your thoughts down and figure out how to do it. And so a lot of what I did is I just went in there and said, okay, what's going on in the brains of these individuals who are effective at making these new plans, who are very smart in these volatile and chaotic conditions, or VUCA, as the Army called them. And what we basically found out is that because leadership is unique and because every new plan is original, there's no right way to make a new plan. There's no right way to lead. Every leader's individual, every leader is special. But leadership failures typically occur in one of four common ways. And once you identify those leadership failures, you can then start to correct them. You stop them from happening, and that gives everybody more of a chance in those moments to find the leader within. And as a result of that, what that means is that instead of just throwing people out of the program because they fail when the bomb goes off, you can essentially recycle them. And you can start to increase the overall rate at which people graduate the program. And more than that, you can start to take that training outside of Special Forces and put it into the regular Army and put it into elementary schools. And so what are the four common leadership failures? They are failure of initiative, failure of emotional confidence, failure of imagination, failure of strategic vision. What does that mean? Well, remember how I told you that being a leader is essentially being able to come up with a new plan that works? That's what a leader does. Failure of initiative means you can't come up with a plan. You just freeze. Failure of emotional confidence means you can come up with a new plan, but you don't try it. You just defer to other people in your environment. You just sit there with this plan, not doing anything with it. Failure of imagination means you can come up with a new plan, but only one new plan. And what you try and do is you try and force that plan on your situation, whether it's working or not. And you'll see this in leaders when they start getting aggressive or irritated with other people. They're just like, it has to be this way, it has to be done that way, right? So that's the third failure. And the fourth and final failure is a failure of strategic vision, which means you're able to come up with a lot of different plans, but they don't go in any particular direction. And so you or your organization is just constantly going in circles. And so what we do in, whether it's in Robin Sage or any of these other training environments, which we've since created, is we put individuals in a situation, we set off a bomb, and then we look at what's going on in their brain and we identify which of these four failures they're having. Are they unable to respond to the bomb by just coming up with a plan? That's the failure of initiative. We take them out and we coach them. We coach up their initiative. Are they able to come up with a plan, but they hesitate to use it? That's a failure of emotional confidence. We take them out and we coach them up, and we start to help work on those neural pathways so that they start to act on these new plans. Do they have a plan, but it's only one plan, right? We pull them out, we coach them up in terms of their imagination. Or, do they have this failure of strategic vision so that when bombs go off, they seem like they're responding, but they're really just going in circles? And so that's what we were able to do with Special Forces, is come up with that kind of like simple way for interrupting leadership failures. And as a result of that, access more of the ability of individuals when they are in volatile and chaotic environments to respond in ways that are effective and to keep themselves and their teams alive long enough for somebody to figure out what to do.
So you talk about, and I'm thinking too about your work now with obviously with not only Special Forces, but human organizations, enterprises, companies, things of that nature. When you say you take them aside and you coach them, can you give us an example of what that actually means? if when there's you kind of identify a failure and actually, I mean, also you talk about neural pathways. How do you identify the failures? Is it just something you observe, and then how do you deal with that?
Yeah. So first of all, the different failures occur in different parts of the brain. So in theory, if you put someone through the training and you've got a brain scanner on them, you can see. So for example, a lot of times a failure of initiative is going to occur right in your amygdala, where you're going to have a strong fear response. If you have like a failure of emotional confidence, that might occur more in your thalamus, where you're having a kind of negative flashback kind of a thing. So all of these different failures can be mapped to different regions of the brain where you see something not clicking. So you can do it that way, but 95% of the time, you can just see with your own eyes what's going wrong.
Okay.
And you can very quickly say to someone, and it's a lot cheaper to do it that way, right? I mean, brain scanning is expensive. It's a lot cheaper, and I think over time, right? Most of these organizations, you want to get experienced coaches that can recognize the signs. And so, for example, the signs of a failure of imagination are anger, irritation, impatience. You don't need a brain scan to see that. You can just very quickly pick up, okay, this person is getting tense and irritable with their team. That's because they only have one plan and they're trying to force it. Because if you have multiple plans, you're relaxed because you can see, okay, well, we could try it this way, we could try it that way. You know what I mean?
Right.
So you can pick up on these other indicators. As far as what we do in terms of coaching, there's tons and tons of different methods for training up initiative, imagination. A lot of that stuff is in the book. But just as a simple example, one of the things that we find a lot of times, particularly with young people nowadays, is they have good initiative. Like they're actually able to come up with plans, but they freeze and don't say them. They silence themselves. So, for example, I went and did a project a couple years ago with NASA before it was unfortunately defunded with a lot of recent NASA exercises. And what we found when we were there is that a lot of young engineers would come in with really brilliant ideas, but they would not express them until they'd been within NASA for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years because they just felt like, oh, I can't
Hmm.
voice this idea. And as a result, NASA was missing out on all these incredible, potentially groundbreaking ideas. And by the time these individuals did start to speak up, they'd been part of NASA for so long that the ideas that they were voicing at that point were actually pretty similar to the ideas that everybody else was saying. And so one of the things that I was told was, hey, we want to figure out a way to get these young, brilliant minds to start speaking up faster. We want them to start voicing these big ideas that they have earlier. What's going on there? And so you can see from that leadership quadrant, what's going on is a failure of emotional confidence. And so what we do in terms of coaching people up in terms of a failure of emotional confidence is we say, well, the reason you're having that failure is essentially you're having a flashback to a time when you voiced an opinion and it didn't work out and you're feeling self-conscious and awkward. You're essentially having a shame response. You're having a negative flashback. That's what's freezing you in that moment. And so what we're going to do is we're going to develop a positive flashback in your mind to help your brain override that. And so we work with people on thinking about moments in which they did speak up or they did take the initiative. And as a result of that, they grew or they learned something. Maybe it didn't work out perfectly, but by taking that step, it helped them take the next step, which helped them take the next step, which helped them take the next step. And the reason that we use this method is that we find in combat situations, if you prepare soldiers ahead of time with a positive flashback, they are much less likely to go into shock. Because the first thing that
Interesting.
happens when you go into a battlefield, right, is stuff starts happening and you don't know where the bullets are coming from. You don't know what's happening. And so most soldiers, the first time they're in combat, they will just freeze. But if you coach them up with these positive flashbacks, they show much less propensity to freeze. They're much more likely to do what we call first step planning. Just take a step and then you start moving and your brain starts moving. And so in the same way with young people at NASA, we kind of worked on these positive flashbacks, and you can just see that that just increases the likelihood that they're going to speak up in a meeting. Now, that doesn't mean their ideas are always good. That doesn't mean that they, tick all the other quadrants, but that's a way that you target that specific problem and you fix that specific problem, and then you can go on and fix the other problems.
So when you talk about, I mean, interesting question. When you talk about intuition, imagination, breaking the model, but how is that kind of counterintuitive to the military of you follow orders? I mean, how how do you deal with that dichotomy with people who have, they've gone through basic training or whatever, and say, you follow orders, and then all of a sudden you're saying, well, but we want you to involve some of these other techniques that kind of break that mold a little bit.
So first of all, one of the great pleasures of working with the U.S. Army is I discovered that all my preconceptions about the Army were wrong. And so one of my preconceptions about the Army was it was all about discipline and following orders.
Right.
And it's certainly true that at the beginning of the process, the Army wants you to learn where the box is, and it wants you to learn how to operate within the box. But it wants you to do that not so you stay in the box, but so you can then learn how to improve the box and go outside the box. It's the same thing if you take a basic art class. You've got to learn how to draw a line before you can become a surrealist or an impressionist. And so really, a lot of what the Army's doing at the beginning is just trying to pass on the wisdom of previous generations in a condensed form so you can catch up to best practices, or as the Army calls them, standard operating procedures. But the Army is actually not interested in programming people. And one of the reasons that the American Army was so effective in World War II is because of this decentralization of command. And so anyone who's interested in this can go back and read about this, but individual units in the regular army and the regular infantry were given a huge amount of autonomy about how they executed orders. They would be told, hey, take that objective, but you've got total latitude on how you get there. And in fact, missions where they were overprogrammed, where they were told exactly what to do, were generally ineffective because you would get on the ground, the conditions would not be the same that they were back in the talk, back in the sort of planning area, and as a result, units would freeze. But whereas when soldiers were told, hey, you've just got this big objective, you can figure out how to get there, they became much more effective. And so the American military and the Army in particular is very interested in decentralizing control. And I think that's something that's important for people outside the Army to recognize is that we have a democratic military. That's what's good about it. Special operations is even more extreme in that direction. So in the regular military, you're dealing with very large units. You could be dealing with 10,000, even 100,000 soldiers at a time. And as a result, you need a lot of coordination between those units. And as a result, you need a lot of care when you start to take the initiative because you don't want to do something that's going to cause a friendly fire incident or something like that. But in special forces, you're dealing often with 12-person teams, or sometimes you're even dealing with 3 or 1-person teams. So you have a huge range for independence and autonomy. So really what this comes down to is developing your brain's ability to identify when is it smart to do what I did in the past, i.e. follow existing procedures, and when do I need to innovate? And the answer is always, it depends on my environment. If my environment is stable, I always want to do what worked in the past. But if my environment is changing, I have to start opening myself up to innovation and doing new things. And to me, this is a kind of classic thing. I was lucky to talk to a couple astronauts while I was writing this book. And, one of the things about space exploration in general is it's an interesting back and forth between these two. When you're out just in pure space itself, so for example, when the astronauts on the original moon landing were moving from Earth to moon, that environment has very little change in it. It's almost like a mathematical simulation because it's just an empty void, there's nothing happening. And so you can allow the autopilot just to fly the spaceship perfectly because there's no disturbances. There's nothing unexpected between the Earth and the moon. It's just a giant hole. But famously, as Armstrong's coming down to land, all of a sudden there are these unexpected rocks below him on the lunar surface, and he has to switch off the autopilot, come up with a new landing plan, and then drop the Eagle safely. And so really what you're trying to do as a special operator, as an astronaut, or just as a regular person is say, am I in a familiar situation? In which case, be disciplined. Do the thing that worked before. Learn from the past. Follow the formula, follow the algorithm. Or is this something new? In which case, I've got to activate my creativity, my intuition, my initiative, my imagination, start venturing and learning through feedback and discovering a new plan and a new path in this fresh situation.
So we have a comment, just it wasn't a question, but somebody just commenting how much they were enjoying the conversation. So thank you, Warren. In the case of transitioning a little bit, in the case of humans leaving the planet, you've really got different scenarios. You've got low Earth orbit, space station, things of that nature. You've got lunar ventures onto the moon, which present different kinds of problems. And then you have what many people are talking about is ultimately, humans going to Mars, which I'm sure at one point in time we will eventually do that. It may be not as soon as people would like to think, just because of some of the hard problems and challenges that we face, not technological, but biological and things of that nature. But the other things that enter into it that really, Angus, I think fit into what you're talking about is the fact of encountering complete uncertainty and unprecedented problems. On in low Earth orbit and on the moon, you don't have really a big problem with communication lags and things of that nature. On a deep space mission, if you're talking about Mars, for example, you may be looking at anywhere from 10, 15, 28-minute communication lags. And so you're also subjecting your body to extended radiation, extended zero-G environments, which we really haven't, we don't fully understand and really can't simulate. So we have to wait till those kinds of things happen. So I'm going to ask a hard question. If you were given the task of training 20 up and coming astronauts for deeper space missions, we'll say, the moon, which is, again, it's 3 days away. But Mars is the other thing. Was Mars is it's a 6-month trip. You can only really come or go every 2.5 years or so because of orbital alignment, and then it's 6 months back. So even on an early mission, whether you land or not, you're probably still looking at 3 years. How would you, and I know this is tough, how would you use what you have been trained to do? How would you approach that? How would you deal with some of those basically truly unprecedented, unknowable scenarios?
So here's the thing. The scenarios are going to be different, but the human brain is going to remain the same.
Okay.
So the same core training that we use with special forces, I would recommend using with the astronauts, at least for this particular bucket. So let me walk through a couple of beats of that, and then you tell me if this is convincing or not. So the two areas where I think that it's really challenging when you think about being an astronaut are, first of all, it's not just that you're dealing with unknowns. You're dealing with unknown unknowns.
Right.
Things you literally cannot prepare for. So you can prepare for a communication lag. That's something you can develop a protocol for before you leave the Earth. But there are going to be things that you encounter on that journey that you cannot imagine ahead of departure that are going to happen. And so the first is you've got to start to accept there are going to be things that come up, life and death things that come up that no one has anticipated. And there is simply not going to be a protocol or procedure that I can take off the shelf for dealing with it. I have to figure it out on the fly. And the history of the American space program is those problems occurring and people figuring them out on the fly. I don't need to go through all of the history of that, but obviously Neil Armstrong himself provides like a number of those examples just through his career. So the first thing is the unknown unknowns. The second thing is you are on your own. You are on your own. You might have a small team, right? Or you might not. It might literally just be you, but you don't have like the huge collective intelligence of NASA with you in that moment. You've got to sort of figure it out when you're in a very isolated situation, dealing with a very novel challenge. That's exactly the same situation that special operators face all the time. They're in unknown unknowns, and they have limited or no communications back, and they have to use their own initiative. So I think broadly the same training would be effective. And what that would mean is a shift away from a lot of the way that we currently train. So for example, one of the things that we know is that a lot of training simulations that use the same problems over and over and over again produce what's known as the optimization trap. And so the optimization trap occurs when you're, say, like a pilot or something, and you're flying the same digital simulator over and over and over again. Actually, what's happening is you're mastering the digital simulator. And that digital simulator is running on a set number of algorithms or rules that your brain can then learn and master. And you get better and better and better at handling the problems that exist within that environment. But then when you step outside the simulation into a real world and an unexpected problem occurs, your brain is much more likely to fracture, to shatter, not literally, but it's much more likely to be unable to come up with a new problem because you've over-optimized it. And over-optimization is a real problem in biological systems and in general in these training environments. And so what that means is that we want to, in addition to using these digital environments in healthy and productive ways so that astronauts can practice things like communication lags and so on and so forth, We also want to do things like put them in environments that are non-digital, where the problems that are being created spontaneously, either through role play or manipulation of the literal physical environment that they're in, just like in Robin Sage. And then what we're looking for in those moments is not whether or not they come up with the right answer, but whether or not they're able to quickly come up with a new plan that keeps the mission on track. And so it's a different process. It's about being good enough as opposed to being perfect. And so you create those environments, for example, by sitting down with a bunch of, senior and experienced astronauts and saying, what are all the problems you could imagine possibly happening on a mission? Just come up with everything you can possibly imagine happening. And then we've got to have that list of problems. And we're going to bring in our trainee astronauts and we're going to start throwing those problems at them, saying, what's your plan? What's your plan? What's your plan for dealing with this hypothetical problem that has never happened before but could happen? Then the moment they come up with that plan, those experienced astronauts respond by coming up with a hypothetical problem with the plan. They say, oh, you did
Right.
that? That's
Okay.
great. But you know what happened? That blew out your oxygen tank. Your oxygen tank is now gone. What do you do? And what you're doing is this continual dynamic environment between humans in which humans are training humans, not you're inside a digital simulator. And what you're monitoring again is how the brain is performing. Is it keeping free of these four leadership failures, or is it going into brain lock? Is its imagination freezing? Is it getting angry? Whatever. And then you're training out those failures as opposed to training up right or optimum answers.
Um, we have one question that came in. Again, anybody that has a question, please feel free to go ahead and post it. This is from actually a neurobiologist who I know, Diane Snow. And she's interested in the question of are there particular kind of neuroscience, brain science breakthroughs or techniques that have recently come to the forefront that have made you smarter about the work that you do?
I
Kind
mean,
of later developments.
that's a great question. And the answer is most of my work really is based on insights that came about in the 1960s, 1970s, and
Okay.
1980s that we have since forgotten about. So a big thing that's happened recently in neuroscience, as I'm sure I don't have to tell your colleague, is that we've focused a lot on cognitive approaches, cognitive science-based approaches, which are essentially computational. It's about thinking about the brain as a series of Bayesian networks. It's about thinking about the brain as an information processor. It's about thinking about how the brain does all these things that computers do. And that holds true for certain parts of the brain, like the visual cortex and whatnot. It's a very powerful information processor. But the parts of the brain that I'm interested in are actually things, certain kind of mechanical aspects of the brain in terms of how the synapse operates in a non-electronic manner, for example, that goes back to work in the 60s. Groups like the Soups, for example, John Eccles and his Nobel Prize. So my own work has mostly been informed actually by mid 20th century research that's been forgotten in the push towards computation, which has been driven, I think, by the rise and power of computers over the 20th century. And, in the same way that I think, what's interesting if you go back to the mid 19th century, what we say is, hey, the big breakthrough in biology in the 19th century was obviously Darwinism. Well, in fact, not really, because Darwin was debunked, quote unquote, by Lord Kelvin,
Mhm.
and nobody really believed in Darwinism until the 1930s and the kind of neo-Darwinism and the genetic revolution. And so, kind of a lot of my work sort of follows that trend of going back and reclaiming a lot of work from the middle of last century and kind of pushing that forward. Having said that, I'm sure there's a lot of brilliant and amazing work happening in neuroscience that I'm not aware of, and I would certainly be very interested and excited to learn more about what other labs are doing.
So, okay, and uh, given the fact that in the case of, as I said, of humans leaving the planet, uh, how do you think about you kind of alluded to it, some of those and those things like communication, like with Earth. I mean, and I want to transition that to talk about, given all of that, what role do you see an AI in playing in helping to cope with some of these very unprecedented, unusual, atypical situations? Do you see a close, given the human AI interface, what are your thoughts on the future of that?
So we want to be specific about what we mean by artificial intelligence. If we mean things like LLMs and chatbots, I don't think that they're going to be very important in the future of
Okay.
space exploration. If we mean, what I would call, real AI,
Right.
neurosymbolic AI, kind of like rigorous machine learning
Right.
kinds of things, you know what I mean? I think everyone in the audience is aware of that kind of foundational AI. That can be incredibly powerful and effective at dealing with either known situations or known unknowns. And I think there's a huge way in which that can take a lot of cognitive load off of humans and off of astronauts in terms of regularizing responses and increasing response times to predictable things that might occur in space. For example, like if you know or you think it's likely that there's going to be a communication lag, you can develop a program or a protocol that's able to deal with that in an effective way. What AI cannot do is it cannot deal with novel situations because there's simply not enough information on those systems for AI to do what it
Right.
does well, which is find patterns and kind of do all these things. So really what you need to do is you then need to develop a way of quickly transitioning over to humans when volatility and uncertainty starts to increase. And humans have to be good and capable at kind of spinning up their human intelligence in those moments. And that's challenging. I mean, one of the things that we know a lot from, at least, I mean, I've seen a lot in special operations. I can imagine you've seen this with astronauts, is that humans get bored very quickly.
Right.
So, if you put like a human in a tin can and you shoot them to Mars, and then they've been in that tin can for, even just a couple of days, they're probably going to be climbing the walls. And so you need to keep them busy. You need to give them things to do that sort of simulate the experience of dealing with unknown unknowns. So one of the things that I would say that's very important when we're sending, or I would imagine is important when we're sending humans into space, is to have, the best computer and AI to deal with these known situations. Then inside that, nested inside that, have an environment where humans can continue to grow, explore, learn, keep these human parts of their brain active, even when nothing interesting is happening in the actual mission itself. And there's all sorts of ways we can do that, build, whether they're curating scientific experiments in space, whether they're, reading, learning, whatever, the stuff you can do. And then have a mechanism whereby if the AI suddenly hits its limit, you have a quick turnover of control to the humans who are able in that moment to engage this part of their brain to figure out a new solution, a new plan until the situation stabilizes and the AI can take over again.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because one of the big points of discussion is the whole idea of isolation and boredom. A 3-year mission. Let's say there's 6 of you, in a capsule, and of course, I won't even get into some of the other collateral problems that enter into that, like food. What are you going to eat? Diversity of food. I've worked with some analog astronauts who talk about, the first thing that everybody, uh, has to deal with very quickly with after a week is food. They get bored right away of the lack of diversity of food. And of course, with humans, it's not just a question of nutrition. You can't just eat granola every day because that's not the human condition. And so you've got all sorts of those kinds of problems as well. Um, let me you mentioned your work with younger people. And I think one of the interesting questions we have today is we are a spacefaring civilization. Uh, that aspect of our planet is growing and now kind of exponentially. And so particularly younger people are going to be the first full generation that is really again, is a part of is a spacefaring species. I mean, what are your thoughts about how do you begin to use some of these techniques and insights into helping young people not necessarily prepare for space travel, although they very well may be doing that, but simply being a part of a spacefaring civilization?
That's a beautiful question. And I think one of the things that's sort of challenging for us now is we know that young people, particularly from the age of 4 onwards, are experiencing more and more trouble dealing with uncertainty and volatility. They're experiencing more anxiety, they're experiencing more anger, they're experiencing just a lot of emotional churn. And this is because partly they spend a lot of time on technology, and technology is designed to create frictionless experiences. The whole point of user design is to make it feel as though, you're getting exactly what you want when you want it. And what that means is the moment you exit a technological space and you start experiencing friction, right? It's uncomfortable for you and you don't like it and you try and get out of it. So because of the use of technology, children are sort of losing that ability that we would have had 100, 200 years ago when kids were, just running around in nature the whole time and kind of experiencing what it was like to interact with a world that didn't just conform to their desires immediately. And then on top of that, we're also raising them in the school system that is just full of standardized testing. And the problem with standardized testing is it trains kids to think that there's a right answer to problems. I mean, that's what a standardized test is. It's like there's a right answer here, you just got to pick it. And the more that you think that there's a right answer, the less likely you are to come up with a new answer. And so that leads to a lot of submissiveness in kids. There's a lot of failure of initiative, a lot of deferring to authority in kids. And so, I think if we're thinking seriously about this kind of voyage into space, what we want to do is, just as we want to build these capsules where humans can be human inside this technological environment, we want to start thinking about how do we build school systems that are more focused on experiencing friction and encouraging children to encounter the same things that they might encounter in an unknown nature, in a foreign world, where there are challenges that they can't just solve by pushing a button or swiping on a screen, and where there are, questions that there isn't a right answer to. Also, going back to your earlier point about, this challenge in space, one of the things I found fascinating is because I work a little bit in prisons, is there's this extraordinary psychological difference between solitude and solitary confinement. So it turns out that people are the happiest they are ever in solitude, but they're the least happy that they ever are in solitary confinement. And you would say, well, why is that? Because it's exactly the same thing, right? Right. You're just away from other people. You're in a silent space. Why is one of them so happy and associated with these spiritual experiences and joy, and the other one just associated with massive amounts of depression and loss of self? And the answer is because it's voluntary. Solitude is voluntary. You choose it. And there's a huge amount of research that shows that autonomy is just really central to people's well-being. And so if I chose to eat granola every day in space, I would be fine with it. If I was forced to eat granola every day in space, I would not be. And so I think a big part of, as we think about creating these environments in which, we're going to flourish in space, is saying, given that there are so many constraints on someone as they're going into space, how do we find ways to maximize autonomy nevertheless? How do we find ways to maximize their control over their environment so they don't experience burnouts, they don't experience depressions, they don't experience loss of purpose and loss of meaning? And I think that's another key thing as we start to think about our school systems right now, because our school systems are essentially squeezing out a lot of autonomy, and thinking, how can we restore that autonomy in a productive way so that kids feel like they are contributing to their own narrative?
Right. Okay. Real quick, we just have a few minutes left. Somebody asked an interesting question. Said they were fascinated by your talk about Shakespeare and your insights to that. Wanted to know, since they're not exactly an expert on literature, are there other ways of learning about Shakespeare that might be useful other than simply reading his plays?
Right. Well, so if they want to read the book, my book, I talk quite a lot about some of the
Yeah,
highlights
he
of
does.
Shakespeare. So that's
I
kind of like
agree.
might be a quick way of doing it. A couple other quick things I would say is that I think the most important line in Shakespeare comes from Hamlet, and it's when Hamlet sees the ghost. And what Hamlet says when he sees the ghost is, as a stranger, give it welcome. In other words, lean into the things you can't explain. Lean into the things that are different from your expectations. The whole point of Shakespeare is to break existing plot structures, break existing
Right.
archetypes, break existing formulas that were handed in from the Middle Ages with this kind of renaissance of new things. And finally, if you don't want to read Shakespeare, there's plenty of amazing writers like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. I could go on and on and on and on, who are influenced by Shakespeare. And so I would say reading near-term science fiction or realistic science fiction is probably about as close as you're going to get in the modern world to reading Shakespeare. So if you get yourself something that is a good novel that's set, 5, 10, 15 years from now in the future, that would be a great way of kind of experiencing what it was like
Okay.
to see Hamlet for the first time.
Great. So we're just about out. I want to also bring up, this is a great book, and a lot of the things that Primal Intelligence and Angus has been talking about are explained in much more detail in the book and getting into some of the Shakespearean philosophy, as well as philosophy of other scientists, philosophers, artists, et cetera, and how they've contributed to this line of thinking. Just so you know, as you know, this will be available online. We record all of these. And so in about a week, if you missed it or you want to review it, you can go on to the Humanity in Deep Space website and click on, and this full conversation will be on there. Let me again thank all of our sponsors and supporters for their support of this project. And those are on your screen now. And also, I want to particularly thank Angus. I've been trying to figure out a way to do a webcast with Angus for about a year and a half to 2 years. And again, when this book came out, I read the book and was just blown away. He said, "This is it. This brings it all together." And I really commend Angus for his very, very kind of convergent, eclectic thinking. And I'm going to think more about how this might apply to, because I think there's some really interesting connections here to as we continue to transition to a spacefaring civilization, and how these kind of techniques and training and insights and knowledge can apply. So, having said that, Angus, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.
Appreciate it. And for those of you, you can always visit our website, humanityindeepspace.com. All of our previous webcasts are on there. We have about 20 or 21 now in our our tank. So please feel free to do those, watch those if you like. Always interested in your comments, and look forward to seeing you for our next webcast. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Humanity in Deep Space. In his book, Pale Blue Dot, A Vision of the Human Future in Space, Carl Sagan wrote, "Your own life, or your band's, or even your species, may be owed to a restless few, drawn by a craving they can hardly articulate or understand, to undiscovered lands and new worlds." Our continued exploration of space is accompanied by profound questions, responsibilities, and obligations. What is our place and ultimate responsibility to the larger universe? And how do we maintain a sense of humanity as we leave the planet Earth? These questions and more are discussed in our videos, as well as other curated content at www.humanityindeepspace.com or on YouTube by joining Humanity in Deep Space. The music for this episode was written and performed by Danny Grandstaff and is available at dannygrandstaff.bandcamp.com.